March 7, 1945, the heights overlooking Remagen, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman lifted his binoculars with hands that shook, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. Through the early afternoon haze, he observed something that defied every tactical assumption of the past 6 months. The bridge remained intact. One bridge, the only bridge. Every German commander from the Rhine to the Elbe had received explicit orders to demolish all crossings before Allied forces could arrive. Yet there it stood, the Ludendorff Bridge, its twin stone towers rising like monuments to German engineering, its steel arches spanning the 300 meters of the Rhine River, Germany's final natural barrier against invasion from the west. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, standing beside Enderman, voiced what would echo through history. We have to take it immediately before they blow it to hell. What none of them realized at that moment was that seizing this single structure would trigger the most catastrophic strategic collapse in German military history, a psychological dismantling of Nazi defensive doctrine so complete that German officers would later describe it as the instant they knew with absolute certainty that the war was lost. The mathematics of this pivotal moment were written not in the blood of soldiers, but in the cold calculus of strategic geometry. The Rhine was not merely a river. It was a fortress 300 meters wide, with currents strong enough to capsize assault boats, depths sufficient to drown armored vehicles, and banks steep enough to trap advancing infantry. Since the time when Roman legions first gazed across its waters into the Germanic forests, the Rhine had stood as central Germany's traditional defense against invasions from the west. In March 1945, it represented Hitler's last hope to buy time to negotiate with the Western Allies or to redeploy divisions from the collapsing Eastern Front for a final stand. The presence of a single intact bridge would shatter that strategic calculation in less than 10 minutes of combat. The context for this disaster had been building for months. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final major offensive in the West, had ended in catastrophe by late January 1945. What German propaganda had labeled a decisive counterattack had instead consumed the Wehrmacht's remaining mobile reserves. Roughly 102 German casualties, 600 tanks destroyed, and the irreplaceable loss of veteran panzer divisions, leaving the German armies west of the Rhine hollow shells of their former strength. By early March, 12 American divisions were advancing toward the river along a front stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland. The German 15th Army, charged with defending the critical sector between Cologne and Koblenz, could muster barely 50,000 combat-effective troops against a force 5 times larger. The bridge itself carried a bitter irony, recognized by neither side. Named after General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's brilliant but ultimately unsuccessful World War I strategist, the structure had been built between 1916 and 1919, largely by Russian prisoners of war. Those prisoners, laboring under brutal conditions, had constructed the bridge too well. Steel trusses were engineered to bear fully loaded military trains. Stone towers at each end contained 3 stories of defensive positions. 4 massive stone piers were sunk deep into the Rhines. Bedrock original plans had included demolition chambers within the bridge itself, cavities designed to hold explosives so the bridge could be destroyed before enemy capture. French occupation forces after World War I had filled those cavities with concrete. When Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, German engineers affixed 60 zinc-lined boxes to the bridge's girders, each designed to hold 3 kilograms of explosives. The system was engineered to detonate simultaneously, collapsing the entire structure into the Rhine within seconds. But fate and Hitler's paranoia had intervened in October 1944. An American bomb struck the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne, detonating its preposition demolition charges and destroying the bridge before German forces intended. Hitler's rage was volcanic. He ordered the immediate court-martial of the officers responsible and demanded that all demolition charges on Rye bridges be removed and stored nearby. New orders specified that charges could only be replaced when Allied forces came within 8 kilometers and bridges could only be destroyed by written order from sector commanders. The policy created a nightmare scenario for German officers. blow a bridge too soon and face court-martial for destroying vital retreat routes, wait too long and face execution for allowing strategic infrastructure to fall into enemy hands. The psychological pressure paralyzed German decision-making at precisely the moment when decisive action was most critical. The American advance toward Remagen had been designated Operation Lumberjack, a modest name for what would become one of the most consequential movements of the entire war. The operation's primary objectives were the capture of Cologne and Koblenz, two ancient cities controlling vital Rhine crossings. The American First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges drove eastward through the Eifel region, facing German resistance that had degraded from organized defense to desperate delaying actions. The German commanders had no illusions about stopping the American advance. Their orders were simply to delay, to buy time for more troops to retreat across the Rhine before the bridges were blown. Major General John Leonard's 9th Armored Division, nicknamed the Phantom Division because German intelligence repeatedly reported it destroyed only to encounter it again days later, led the American spearhead. The morning of March 7th began with fog blanketing the Rhine Valley. German command chaos had reached levels that would have been considered impossible in the Wehrmacht of 1940. General Edwin von Rothk, commander of the 53rd Corps responsible for the Remagen sector, had accidentally wandered into American lines on March 6th and been captured. His replacement, General Richard von Othma, could not reach Rayon because American units had already cut the roads. At 1 in the morning on March 7th, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps was informed that he now bore responsibility for defending the Ludendorff Bridge despite being 64 kilometers away and having never seen the structure. Hitzfeld immediately dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to take command of the bridge defense. Scheller departed at 3 in the morning with 8 men and a radio, intending to commandeer retreating units to form a defensive perimeter. The journey became a nightmare of wrong turns, American roadblocks, and fuel shortages. The radio unit became separated. Scheller did not arrive at Remagen until 11:15, less than 2 hours before American forces would crest the heights overlooking the town. Captain Willy Bratke, the German commandant actually present at Remagen, commanded a force that existed more on paper than in reality. His official strength was listed as 600 men. The actual combat power consisted of 36 soldiers, most of them either wounded, elderly, or young boys from the Volkster militia. Many were Osttroppen, Soviet prisoners of war who had agreed to serve in German uniform to escape prison camps. Their reliability in combat against Americans was questionable at best. Brach had spent weeks pleading for reinforcements, for proper radio equipment, for anything that might help him defend a strategic objective that everyone seemed to have forgotten until the Americans appeared on the horizon. His requests disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing command structure. The demolition charges that should have been permanently installed on the bridge were still stored in a nearby building, awaiting orders to be replaced. When those orders finally came on March 6th, engineer officers scrambled to place 2,800 kilograms of explosives in the piers and attach 300 kg-shaped charges to critical structural points. The American approach on March 7th had an element of accidental destiny. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman commanded a task force from the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command B, consisting of elements from the 14th Tank Battalion and the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. Their orders were to capture the town of Remagen and then turn south to Link, up with the Third Army. No one expected to find an intact bridge. American intelligence had confirmed that German engineers were systematically destroying every Rhine crossing as Allied forces approached. Photographers had documented the destruction of bridges at Cologne-Bonn and Koblenz. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen should have been demolished days earlier. When Enderman's lead elements emerged from the woods overlooking the town at approximately Hued in the afternoon, the sight that greeted them seemed almost surreal. German military vehicles were still crossing the bridge. Civilians crowded the approaches. The structure stood intact, its demolition charges visible as dark shapes attached to the steelwork. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, A 22-year-old platoon leader who had been born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1922 and had immigrated to the United States with his parents as an infant would lead the assault. He spoke fluent German and understood the significance of what they were seeing better than most. The bridge represented something far more valuable than a crossing point. It represented the last barrier's failure, the final natural obstacle overcome not by massive assault, but by a combination of luck and German paralysis. Brigadier General William Haag, commander of Combat Command B, arrived at the heights at approximately 2:45. He grasped the strategic implications immediately. This was not merely an opportunity to cross the Rhine, but a chance to vault 3 weeks ahead of Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder scheduled for late March. Hoger made the decision that would define his military career. We're taking that bridge now. The German defenders were caught in the worst possible tactical situation. Major Scheller had arrived at the bridge approach just over 2 hours earlier, exhausted from his nightmarish journey and stunned by what he found. Captain Bratch briefed him in minutes. The bridge was prepared for demolition with electrical detonators controlled from the eastern tunnel entrance. A backup system consisted of a fuse that could be lit manually. The defensive perimeter was non-existent. Most of the troops Scheller expected to commandeer were already across the bridge or bypassing Remagen entirely. The morning fog that had cloaked the landscape lifted at precisely the worst possible moment, granting American artillery observers flawless visibility. Around 3:15 p.m., American tanks emerged at the western approach to the town. There was no time left for hesitation. The assault on Remagen itself lasted under 30 minutes. Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon of M26 Pershing tanks, the newest and most formidable American armored vehicles in the European theater, led the charge. Most German soldiers had never seen Pershings before. Equipped with 90mm guns capable of piercing any German armor, they embodied yet another symbol of American industrial dominance. The tanks fired white phosphorus rounds to create smoke screens and pounded German positions with high explosive shells. Timmermann's infantry advanced behind them, moving through streets scarred by years of Allied bombing. Remagen had once been a picturesque Rhine resort town. By March 1945, more than half of its buildings lay in ruins. The few German troops trying to defend the town retreated quickly, many fleeing across the bridge. Captain Brad, observing the American advance from near the western tower, knew the decisive moment had arrived. At 3:20 p.m., he gave the order to demolish the western approach ramp. The resulting explosion created a 3-meter-wide crater, blocking American tanks from driving directly onto the bridge. But the main structure remained intact. The race for the bridge became a matter of minutes and meters. American tanks stationed at the western end fired their 90mm guns at German positions on the eastern heights. The eastern bank rose 180 meters in basalt cliffs, bristling with German anti-aircraft guns that now depressed their barrels to target advancing troops. Timmermann's infantry, about 120 soldiers from A Company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, began crossing the bridge around 3:50 p.m., advancing in short bursts and using the stone towers and railings for cover. German machine guns opened fire from the eastern towers and the tunnel mouth beyond, creating a lethal crossfire as bullets ricocheted off steel and stone. Several Americans fell immediately, but the remainder pressed forward. Major Scheller, observing from the eastern tunnel entrance, faced the most critical decision of his day. The bridge was rigged with explosives, and the electrical detonation system was ready. American troops were already halfway across. Military doctrine dictated detonation, but Lieutenant Karl Peters, commanding a battery of the new Henschel HS-297 rocket launchers, pleaded for a delay. His top-secret battery remained on the western side of the bridge. Its advanced rockets could not fall into enemy hands. Scheller agreed to wait, a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. Captain Karl Timmermann, the engineer responsible for the demolition charges, manned the detonator. When Peters' battery finally cleared, Timmermann received Scheller's order. Around 4:00 p.m., with Americans 2/3 across, Timmermann triggered the system. But nothing happened. The electrical circuits had likely been severed by a shell earlier, though the exact cause remained uncertain. Sergeant Alex Drabeek, a 34-year-old from Toledo, Ohio, became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern Rhine bank since Napoleon's forces had crossed over a century earlier. Behind him, Timmermann's men continued advancing. Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and his team rushed to cut remaining wires, attempting to neutralize backup charges before German engineers could react. Corporal Anton Faust volunteered for a desperate mission, sprinting roughly 100 meters under fire to ignite the backup fuse manually. At approximately 4:15 p.m., the resulting explosion shook the bridge. It lifted several inches before settling back into place. Smoke and debris filled the air, and American soldiers were thrown to the deck, but the structure remained standing. The steel arches were damaged but intact. A 6-inch sag in the roadway still allowed passage. The bridge held. The Americans had won. Chaos followed, tempered only by training and discipline. American combat engineers swarmed the bridge, dismantling remaining charges and repairing the approach ramp. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser's 27th Armored Infantry Battalion established a defensive perimeter from the tunnel entrance across the slopes of the Epaulet. German resistance collapsed rapidly. Captain Brad and surviving troops took shelter in the 400-meter railroad tunnel beneath the town. By 5:30 p.m., Lieutenant Timmermann had secured the tunnel entrance and captured several hundred prisoners, many relieved that their ordeal was over. Major Scheller, realizing the bridge was lost and taking formal responsibility, rode east on a bicycle to report to his corps headquarters. He was arrested 4 days later, court-martialed, and executed as a scapegoat for a failure with many causes. News of the capture traveled rapidly up the American chain of command. Around 5 p.m., Brigadier General Hoger radioed Major General John Leonard with the words, "We got the bridge." Leonard passed the news to First Army headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, mid-meeting, reportedly knocked over his coffee in excitement before calling General Omar Bradley. "Brad, we've got a bridge," he said. Bradley, standing, asked, "A bridge? Intact on the Rhine?" Leonard confirmed. Bradley's response became legendary. "Hot dog, Courtney. This will bust him wide open. Are you getting your stuff across?" Hodges replied, "As fast as we can push it." Eisenhower was informed and immediately understood its significance. The capture presented a rare opportunity that could decisively influence the campaign. Originally, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was scheduled to make the primary Rhine crossing at Wesel later in March, supported by airborne forces and heavy artillery. The Remagen Bridge forced a complete strategic shift. Eisenhower ordered Bradley to exploit the bridgehead immediately, redirecting every available unit. The German reaction was panic and brutal scapegoating. Hitler, realizing the Rhine defense plan was collapsing, sought someone to punish. He dispatched General Rudolf Hubner to conduct a flying court-martial with a firing squad. Field Marshal Ger von Runet was dismissed and replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kessler, though even he acknowledged that Remagen was beyond saving. The court-martial proceeded swiftly. Major Hans Scheller, Lieutenant Karl Peters, Major August Kraft, and Major Herbert Straubel were all sentenced to death and executed in the forests near Rimbach and Oberursund on March 14, 1945. Captain Willie Bratt was tried in absentia, already in American custody, and likewise sentenced. Captain Karl Fesenhan, also captured, was tried in absentia and acquitted, a rare moment of rationality amidst the chaos. Field Marshal Model personally endorsed the executions and ordered that news of them be distributed to every unit in the German military as a warning. The message was clear: failure would be punished with death regardless of circumstances. While German officers were being executed for losing the bridge, American forces were pouring across it in numbers that grew by the hour. The bridge itself remained standing, but was clearly damaged. Engineers worked around the clock to shore up weakened sections and repair the approach ramp. A combat engineer battalion erected lights for nighttime traffic. Military police directed the flow of men and vehicles. Within 24 hours of the capture, more than 8,000 American troops had crossed into the bridge head on the eastern bank. Tank companies, artillery batteries, infantry battalions, all flowing across the only intact Rhine Bridge between Switzerland and the North Sea. But the Americans knew the bridge could collapse at any moment. Combat engineers began construction of tactical bridges immediately. By March 9th, 48 hours after the capture, the first tactical bridge was completed. An M1940 aluminum alloy treadway bridge erected just north of the Ludendorff Bridge. Work began immediately on a second pontoon bridge. The American plan was to make the bridgehead irreversible regardless of what happened to the original structure. The German response to the bridgehead was everything Hitler's strategic reserves could muster, which by March 1945 meant a collection of ad hoc battle groups thrown together from shattered divisions and rear echelon units. The Luftwaffe, which had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength, launched repeated air attacks against the bridge. Over the next 10 days, American intelligence counted 367 separate German air sorties targeting the Remagen area. The Americans responded by assembling the largest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery in the European theater. 5 anti-aircraft battalions with hundreds of guns created a defensive box around the bridge. The anti-aircraft battles became some of the most intense of the entire war. American gunners claimed to have shot down more than 100 German aircraft in the 10 days following the bridge's capture. The Germans employed their newest technology in desperate attempts to destroy the bridge. Ardo R-234 jet bombers, the world's first operational jet bombers, attacked in diving runs that exceeded 800 km/h. The jets were nearly impossible to intercept, but their bombing accuracy at high speed was poor. Most of their bombs missed the bridge. The Germans also deployed the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. These aircraft, faster than anything the Allies could field, represented German technological innovation at its peak. But technology could not overcome the fundamental problem. There were too few aircraft, too little fuel, too few experienced pilots. The German air attacks inflicted casualties and damage, but failed to destroy either the original bridge or the tactical bridges being erected alongside it. Hitler personally authorized the use of V-2 rockets against the bridge, marking the first and only time these strategic weapons were employed against a tactical target. The V-2, a ballistic missile that reached speeds exceeding 5,000 km/h, was designed to terrorize London, not to hit precise military targets. 11 V-2s were launched at Remagen from launch sites in the Netherlands 130 kilometers away. The rockets killed a handful of American soldiers and an unknown number of German civilians in nearby towns. Not one hit the bridge. The Germans sent frogmen down the Rhine. 7 naval demolition specialists wearing Italian-made underwater breathing apparatus. The Americans detected them using canal defense lights, a secret technology that projected intense beams across the water surface. All 7 frogmen were killed or captured. The Germans floated explosive-laden boats down the river. Mines disguised as logs even deployed the cowardice, a 600mm super-heavy siege mortar that fired shells weighing over 2 tons. The cowardice was one of the largest artillery pieces ever built. Its shells could demolish fortifications in a single hit, but the weapon's accuracy was limited, and moving it into position took days. The few shells that were fired at the bridge missed. The psychological impact of all this German effort was the opposite of what Hitler intended. Every failed attack on the bridge reinforced American morale while demonstrating German desperation. American soldiers fighting in the bridge had understood they were witnessing the death throes of the Wehrmacht. German soldiers understood it too. Prisoners captured in the bridgehead fighting expressed relief that their war was over. Many had been expecting orders to counterattack the bridge, orders they knew would be suicide missions. The American presence across the Rhine destroyed whatever hope remained that Germany could avoid total defeat. The strategic calculations were brutally simple. With American forces already across the Rhine in strength, the river had ceased to function as a defensive barrier. Every German division deployed to contain the Remagen Bridge. Head was a division unavailable to defend against the massive Allied crossing operations, planned for late March. The German defensive front was being pulled apart by forces it could no longer contain. Major General Karl Wagner, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model, later provided the most concise German assessment of Remagen's strategic impact. The capture of the bridge signaled the end of the war for Germany. Var stated in post-war interrogations, "The Remagen affair caused a great feeling of guilt and shame among the German command. It demonstrated that the Allies now had complete initiative and that German forces could only react, never seize the advantage." The failure to destroy the bridge symbolized the complete breakdown of German command and control, the inability to execute even basic military operations for German officers trained in the Prussian tradition of military excellence. This failure cut deep. It was not merely a tactical defeat, but a moral collapse. Proof that the Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe in 1940 had disintegrated beyond recognition. The bridge collapsed on March 17th at approximately 3:00 in the afternoon. The structure had stood for 10 days under conditions no engineer had ever anticipated. American traffic had been continuous, thousands of vehicles crossing and recrossing. German artillery had scored direct hits and near misses. Air attacks had caused cumulative damage. The vibrations from nearby explosions had stressed, metal fatigued by decades of use. And the failed German demolition attempt on March 7th. Witnesses reported hearing rivets popping like gunshots in the minutes before the collapse. A vertical hanger on the southern arch snapped, then another. The entire center span lifted briefly, then fell into the Rhine with a roar that could be heard for Cologne. American combat engineers died in the collapse with over 60 injured. Most were members of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion who had been working on repairs at the moment of failure. Tyranny was bitter. The men who had saved the bridge through their frantic work to disarm German demolition charges nowdied because their repairs could not overcome the accumulated damage. But by the time the bridge fell, it had become strategically irrelevant. American combat engineers had completed 2 tactical bridges and were finishing a third. Pontoon bridges, treadway bridges, and Bailey bridges now span the Rhine at multiple points near Remagen. More than 25,000 American troops had crossed the damaged Ludendorff Bridge before it fell. After its collapse, the rate of crossing actually increased because the tactical bridges could handle heavier traffic. By March 25th, 18 days after the bridge's initial capture, over 125,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. 6 entire divisions with their tanks, artillery, and supply trains had established themselves east of the river. The bridgehead was 8 m deep and 25 m wide. It included 11 km of the critical autobahn connecting the Ruhr industrial region with Frankfurt. American forces were positioned to drive deep into central Germany. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead began on March 25th. American armored divisions that had been constrained by the narrow bridgehead perimeter suddenly exploded eastward. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division covered 108 corps in a single day. Combat Command A advanced 110 corps in 11 hours. German resistance, which had been fierce in the narrow confines around the bridge, evaporated across the wider front. Entire German units surrendered rather than face annihilation. On March 29th, Combat Command A captured more than 200 prisoners in a single engagement. The American advance was so rapid that German commanders lost track of their own units. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B, which had numbered approximately 325,000 men before the Remagen breakout, began to disintegrate. Divisions lost contact with Corps headquarters. CPS lost contact with Army commands. The command structure that had held the Wehrmacht together through 5 years of war was coming apart. The strategic implications cascaded through the German defensive system. Field Marshal Model found himself commanding an army group that was simultaneously trying to defend against the Remagen Bridge head, contain American forces breaking out from other Rhine crossing sites, and prevent encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region. All 3 objectives were impossible to achieve with the forces available. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart and the source of 80% of its coal and steel production, was about to be cut off. Model understood that losing the Ruhr meant losing any possibility of continued war production. Without coal and steel, the Wehrmacht could not replace losses, could not fuel its vehicles, could not manufacture ammunition. The loss of Remagen Bridge had created the conditions for the loss of the RU. The loss of the RU meant the end of the war. By March 31st, 3 weeks after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, all 4 American armies operating on the Western Front had crossed the Rhine. The crossing that Allied planners had anticipated would require elaborate amphibious operations. Massive casualties and weeks of fighting had been accomplished with stunning speed. The Rhine, which had held the Roman legions at bay and served as Germany's western rampart for 2 millennia, had been breached at multiple points in less than a month. Eisenhower's assessment captured the magnitude of the achievement. "We were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge," he wrote in his memoirs. "The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany was pierced." The final defeat of the enemy, which we had long calculated would be accomplished in the spring and summer campaigning of 1945, was suddenly now in our minds just around the corner. The American assessment was echoed by observers from other nations. War correspondents declared that the war had been shortened by months. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose carefully planned Operation Plunder Rhine Crossing had been eclipsed by the American success at Remagen, acknowledged the strategic significance. Soviet commanders, watching the rapid Allied advance from the east, accelerated their own operations to ensure they reached Berlin first. The race for Germany had become a sprint, and the starting gun had been fired at Remagen. German military authorities offered varying assessments of how much the loss of the bridge had shortened the war. Some claimed weeks, others months. The truth was that precise calculations were impossible because the strategic effects were systemic rather than linear. The bridge's capture had not merely advanced the Allied timetable, but had fundamentally altered German strategic options. Before Remagen, German commanders could imagine holding the Rhine through April and possibly into May, using the time to reinforce defenses around Berlin and negotiate with the Western Allies for a separate peace that would allow concentration against the Soviets. After Remagen, such calculations became fantasy. The Rhine had fallen 3 weeks ahead of schedule. German reserves that should have been used to defend against Montgomery's crossing in the north had been consumed in futile attempts to eliminate the Remagen bridge head. The psychological impact on German troops was incalculable but devastating. Colonel F. Russell Lyons, the 3rd Corps engineer whose men had captured and held the bridge, estimated that having an intact bridge saved the Allies 2 months of fighting and 35,000 casualties. This calculation was based on comparing the Remagen crossing with the amphibious operations required at other Rhine crossing sites. At Well, where Montgomery's Operation Plunder unfolded, the British and Americans assembled over 200 artillery pieces, conducted elaborate airborne drops, and suffered substantial casualties despite overwhelming superiority. At Remagen, American forces had crossed with minimal casualties because the bridge eliminated the need for assault boats, the most vulnerable phase of any river crossing. Historian Ken Heckler, who conducted extensive post-war interviews with participants from both sides, concluded that the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge materially hastened the ending of the war. Other historians suggested the capture shortened the war by approximately 6 months. The variations in estimates reflected different methodologies and assumptions, but the consensus was clear. Remagen had been a turning point. The human cost of the bridge's capture and defense provides another measure of its significance. American casualties in the Battle of Remagen and the subsequent fighting in the bridge had totaled approximately 860 killed, with nearly 5,700 wounded and an approximately equal number missing. These were heavy losses, but they were concentrated in the first 18 days of fighting from March 7th to March 25th. German casualties in the same period exceeded 11,700 prisoners alone, with killed and wounded numbers that were never accurately tallied, but certainly exceeded 10,000. The disparity reflected the fundamental imbalance of forces. The Americans had air superiority, artillery superiority, armored superiority, and the psychological advantage of knowing they were winning. The Germans had orders to counterattack that they could not fulfill, equipment that was breaking down, and the growing certainty that the war was lost. The executions of the German officers held responsible for losing the bridge cast a dark shadow over the military's honor code. Major Hans Scheller had been a 31-year-old career officer who had served with distinction on both the Eastern and Western fronts. He had been married and had young children he would never see grow up. His crime had been arriving at the bridge 2 hours before it was captured and failing to perform a miracle with 36 exhausted soldiers against several thousand Americans supported by tanks and artillery. Lieutenant Karl Peters had been a technical specialist trying to save secret equipment from capture. His execution occurred despite testimony that he had acted in accordance with standing orders to preserve advanced technology. Majors Kraft and Straubel had been following standard procedures for preparing demolition charges. None of the 4 men deserved death. All 4 were scapegoats for a system that had collapsed from the top. After the war, General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, who had conducted the flying court-martial, was tried by German courts and sentenced to 4 years in prison for his role in the illegal executions. It was a modest sentence for judicial murder, but it established that even in Germany's darkest hour, some officers had recognized that the trials were a travesty. The final assessment of Remagen's significance must include its role in the Allied strategic debate about how to end the war. Before Remagen, there had been serious discussion about whether to halt at the Rhine and allow the Soviets to bear the brunt of the final assault on Germany. Some British and American planners argued that crossing the Rhine would be costly, and that Soviet forces, attacking from the east, could accomplish the same objective with less Western loss of life. Remagen made that debate moot. With American forces already across the Rhine and expanding their bridgehead, halting made no strategic sense. The momentum must be maintained. The rapid advance from the Rhine to the Elbe River, accomplished in just over a month, vindicated that decision. American forces met Soviet forces at Toga on April 25th, cutting Germany in 2. By May 8th, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The bridge's capture had reverberations beyond the immediate military situation. In the United States, news of the capture reached the Senate while in session. The leadership suspended its rule against applause, and senators stood and cheered. Newspapers across America ran headlines declaring that the end of the war in Europe was in sight. War bond sales surged. The psychological impact on American public morale was substantial. After years of war, after tens of thousands of casualties, victory was finally tangible and near. In Germany, news of the bridge's loss spread through the military and civilian population with demoralizing effect. Germans had been told by propaganda that the Rhine was impregnable, that the Allies would shatter themselves against its defenses. The discovery that the Rhine had been crossed almost casually, that a single bridge had remained intact through a combination of American luck and German dysfunction, destroyed what little faith remained in the regime's competence. The physical remains of the Ludendorff Bridge tell their own story. After the war, the structure was not rebuilt. The twisted steel and broken stone were cleared from the Rhine, but the towers on both banks remained standing. The western towers were eventually converted into a peace museum, the Freiriden's Museum Brick von Maragen. The museum's exhibits trace the bridge's history from its construction through its destruction, with special attention to the March 1945 battle and its consequences. The eastern towers on the side now serve as a performing arts space. The contrast between their wartime and peacetime roles is intentional, a statement that destruction can give way to creation. The soldiers who captured the bridge received recognition commensurate with their accomplishment. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest decoration for valor. Sergeant Alex Drabik earned the same honor. Scores of other soldiers from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars. Brigadier General William Hoger was promoted and given command of a corps. The entire 9th Armored Division received a Presidential Unit citation for its actions at Remagen. These honors acknowledged both individual and collective bravery, but they could not fully convey the broader significance of what had been achieved, the men who crossed. The bridge under fire had not simply secured a tactical objective. They had taken part in a moment that altered the course of the war. Every day the conflict was shortened meant thousands of lives saved, both military and civilian. The soldiers who fought at Remagen contributed directly to that outcome. The Remagen episode also raises profound questions about the role of chance in history. If the fog had not lifted when it did, would American scouts have spotted the bridge before it was destroyed? If the electrical detonation system had worked correctly, would the bridge have been obliterated with American troops on it? If Major Scheller had arrived 2 hours earlier, could he have organized a defense capable of delaying the Americans? If Hitler had not ordered the removal of explosives after the Cologne incident, would the charges at Remagen have been properly installed and functional? Each of these what-ifs implies a different scenario, a history in which the bridge was demolished and the Rhine crossing unfolded according to the original Allied timetable. The chain of contingencies that led to the bridge's capture demonstrates that history is not predetermined. Individual choices and random events can produce consequences far beyond what anyone could anticipate. The final reflection must return to the human dimension. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was the result of men acting under extraordinary stress and danger. Lieutenant Timmermann leading his company across a bridge that could explode at any moment. Sergeant Drabik sprinting toward the eastern bank under German machine gun fire. The combat engineers working under fire to disarm demolition charges. The tank crews providing covering fire from the western bank. The staff officers who recognized the opportunity and made the decisive call. The commanders who redirected entire formations to exploit the breakthrough. Every person in this chain made decisions that shaped the outcome. Remove any single link, and the result might have been different. This acknowledgement of individual agency within larger historical forces is what renders the story compelling. The men at Remagen were not mere pawns of historical inevitability, but actors who influenced events through their courage and judgment. The 80th anniversary of the bridge's capture in March 2025 was marked by ceremonies in both Remagen and the United States. Veterans organizations, historical societies, and military units tracing their lineage to the 9th Armored Division participated in events honoring the soldiers who fought there. The German government recognized the battle's significance while emphasizing lessons about the costs of war and the value of peace. The commemorations reflected the complex legacy of the event. For Americans, it was a moment of triumph, a validation of courage and decisive leadership. For Germans, it was a reminder of defeat, but also of liberation from Nazism. For historians, it was a case study in the interplay of contingency and determinism in warfare. For all participants, it was a reminder that decisions made in moments of crisis can shape the course of history. The men who captured the bridge at Remagen could not have foreseen that their actions would become the subject of books, films, and scholarly research. They were soldiers fulfilling their duty under circumstances none of them would have chosen. That their service led to outcomes of global historical significance testifies to the unpredictable nature of war and the enduring value of courage.